"She's right," Daniel said, and he did not even look ashamed. Sarah kept both hands around her coffee mug. "If we rented this space to someone else, we'd get $1,500 a month." I stared at the kitchen table, at a water ring shaped like a pale coin. Then she said it cleanly. "So 1,000 from you is more than fair." No one laughed. No one softened it. I looked at my son, waiting for him to remember who I was. He only shrugged once and said, "Dad, she has a point." That was the moment I understood what I had become in that house. Not a father, not a grandfather, a line on a budget they had not finished squeezing. If you have ever sat across from your own family and felt the temperature change, you know how quiet a room can get. I did not raise my voice. I did not pound the table. I just asked, "On top of the groceries, the bills, and everything else?" Sarah nodded like she was explaining weather. "We're just being realistic." Daniel finally looked at me then. "Don't make this bigger than it is." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, because it was practiced. I had heard versions of it for months, maybe longer. I just had not let myself hear them. "I am Robert. I am 55 years old. I live in Ohio." By the time that kitchen conversation happened, my wife, Linda, had been gone long enough for people to expect me to be functional again. That is how grief works for other people. They visit, they call, they say your name softly for a while. Then they start talking about practical things. Linda died of cancer. There is no cleaner way to say it. One year she was tired more often than usual. Then there were appointments. Then treatments. Then schedules built around bad news. Then silence. After she was gone, the house in Dayton changed shape without moving a single wall. It was still a 3-bedroom house. Still the same porch. Still the same kitchen window over the sink. But once one person is missing, a house can feel too large and too tight at the same time. We had lived there for almost 3 decades. 41 years of marriage leaves marks everywhere. A chair pulled out farther than the others. A drawer that sticks because one person always yanked it. A closet with space in it that does not feel like space. I used to wake before sunrise and listen for Linda in the bathroom. For months after she died, I still listened. The worst part was evening. Evening is when a house starts asking questions. I ate in the same kitchen where she used to stand with one hand on her hip. I passed the bedroom and saw the side of the bed she would never use again. I kept the television on longer than I wanted just to hear another voice. Daniel started calling most nights. At first, those calls mattered. He would ask if I had eaten, ask if I had slept, ask if I needed anything from Columbus. Sometimes Sarah came on the line too. Her voice was always warm in a careful way. "Just checking on you, Robert. We worry about you. You shouldn't be alone all the time." When you lose your wife after 41 years, concern sounds like shelter. I let it in. For a while, those calls were the reason I stopped staring at the walls. Daniel told me about work. Sarah told me about the kids. The grandchildren shouted into the phone, "Grandpa, come see my drawing. Grandpa, when are you visiting?" I would sit at that kitchen table in Dayton and smile at nothing. I thought maybe this was how families close ranks after a loss. No speeches, no drama, just steady contact. Then, little by little, the wording changed. It came in pieces. Daniel would say, "That house is a lot for one person." Sarah would add, "We hate the idea of you rattling around in there." Later, she said their basement in Columbus could be a nice little apartment. She said there was no pressure. That phrase mattered then. I noticed it because she repeated it. "No pressure, Robert. Only if you want. Your family." Family was the key they used every time. I did not resist much. That still bothers me. I had been alone for months. I had not heard Linda laugh in that house for months. I had not sat at a dinner table with other people for months. When someone offers noise, children, movement, and a place to belong, your judgment changes. That is what loneliness does. It does not make you stupid. It makes certain risks sound reasonable. I drove to Columbus several weekends in a row. I looked at their basement. It was finished well enough. Not fancy, but private. A small sitting area. A bathroom. A bedroom space. I told myself it would be temporary, just until the days stopped feeling so long. No one pushed, at least not directly. Daniel said, "Think about it." Sarah said, "We would love having you close." The children hugged me every time I visited. That made the next part easier than it should have been. I packed boxes in Dayton. I left Linda's side of the closet alone until the end. I stood in our bedroom with one box on the bed and did nothing for almost an hour. By the time I moved into their house in Columbus, I believed I was stepping toward family. I did not know I was stepping into an arrangement. There is a difference. I learned it slowly, then all at once. And by the time Sarah asked me for $1,000 in rent, I could trace every step back to those phone calls. That first soft concern, that first mention of the house, that first no pressure. I remember all of it now. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And I had finally started seeing it. Part 2. The first summer in Columbus was the closest I came to feeling normal again. That is true. There were evenings when Daniel stood beside me at the grill and talked like he used to. The kids ran through the yard. Sarah handed out plates. For a few hours at a time, the world looked repaired from a distance. I remember smoke from the barbecue and the screen door slapping shut. I remember one of the kids asking if I would live there forever. Everybody laughed. Sarah said, "As long as he wants." Daniel added, "You're home, Dad." No one spoke after that for a second. At the time, I took that silence as feeling. Looking back, I am less sure. My basement space worked well enough. I kept it neat. I stayed out of their way. I cooked sometimes. I fixed small things when they broke. A loose hinge. A bad latch. A dripping faucet. It felt good to be useful again. That was part of the trap. Not theirs at first. Mine. A man who has spent decades carrying weight does not know what to do with empty hands. I woke early. I took out trash before anyone asked. I made myself easy to have around. Daniel noticed some of it. Sarah noticed all of it. That difference mattered later. At first, though, they both knew how to make the arrangement feel warm. Sarah would say, "I don't know what we'd do without you." Daniel would say, "This is good for all of us." And it was, at least on the surface. I had family noise upstairs. I had grandchildren running down the basement stairs to show me school projects. I had people around the dinner table again. After Linda died, that felt enormous. I did not question enough. Grief narrows you. You stop evaluating a place the way you normally would. You ask one question instead. Can I breathe here? For a while, I could. Then the comments about my house in Dayton started coming more often. Always gentle. Always practical. Never once as an order. Daniel said the market was high. Sarah said empty houses cost money. Daniel asked if I was driving back there enough to justify keeping it. Sarah wondered about maintenance, insurance, and taxes. She never said sell it. She listed facts and left them on the table. Then Daniel would say, "It's your decision, Dad." Your decision, but the same decision, from two different mouths. Every week. I noticed it. I just did not challenge it. Instead, I answered as if I was undecided, even when I knew where I was leaning. That was the first time I played dumb on purpose. I wanted to hear how they talked when they thought I needed persuading. So I said, "Maybe I'll hold on to it another year." Daniel paused too long. Sarah smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Of course, whatever feels right." Then she asked, "Even with the market this strong?" There it was, a little push, a little faster than before. Linda and I always watched numbers carefully. We were not rich, but we were precise. You learn a lot about motives by listening to which costs people mention first. Sarah always mentioned waste, unused space, missed opportunity, money slipping away. Daniel mostly echoed her. That alone did not prove anything. A family can be practical without being predatory. That is why this gets messy. From the outside, they could have looked concerned. From the inside, I still wanted to believe they were. Slow betrayal does not come at you with a knife. It comes wearing concern and carrying a calculator. By late summer, I drove to Dayton less often. Each trip back took something out of me. I opened the front door and smelled a life that had ended. I walked room to room with no reason. I checked mail. I stood in the bedroom longer than I meant to. Then I drove back to Columbus in the dark. One Sunday evening, Daniel called while I was on the highway. "You okay?" "Yes. Just checking. Long drive for nothing, right?" "Nothing." That word sat there. I said, "It's still my house." He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "I know. I just hate seeing you stretch thin." He said it well. That is what made this harder. He did not sound greedy. He sounded worried. At dinner a few nights later, Sarah brought up school districts, not directly connected to my house. Not at first. She talked about how fast neighborhoods were changing, how hard it was for families to get ahead, how you had to make smart moves when chances came. Daniel nodded through the whole thing. Then he said, "Sometimes holding on costs more than letting go." No one said Dayton. No one had to. That is how the pressure worked. Light touch. Repeated contact. Never enough to point at. Always enough to feel. By then, I had started keeping mental notes. A sentence here, a pause there, a look between them when money came up. I did not confront either of them. Not yet. I tested the room instead. One afternoon, I told Sarah I might rent the Dayton house out rather than sell it. She was loading dishes. Her hands stopped for 1 second. Just one. Then she said, "That could become a headache." She asked 3 questions in under a minute. Would I manage it myself? Would I trust tenants? Would I want strangers in a house full of memories? A few days later, I told Daniel the same thing. He frowned immediately. Why create work for yourself? I shrugged. It's an option, he said. Selling sounds cleaner. That word again. By then, I still told myself they meant well. I did not know. I suspected, then doubted my own suspicion, then watched more carefully. Every time I almost spoke up, one of the grandchildren came downstairs laughing, or Sarah thanked me for being there. The human parts blurred the harder parts. At that point, I still could not prove anything. I only knew the pressure around Dayton had become too steady to ignore. And once I noticed that, I noticed everything else more clearly. Part 3. I sold the house in Dayton a few months later. Even now, that sentence lands hard. Because a house is not just lumber after that many years. It is repetition. It is habit. It is proof that 2 people stayed. Linda and I had built our adult life inside those walls. We had argued there, paid bills there, raised a child there, buried bad years there, and had good ones anyway. So no, selling it was not some clean financial decision. It was a removal, a final one. Daniel drove down with me the last weekend before closing. He said he wanted to help. And he did help, in the visible ways. He carried boxes. He hauled old things to the car. He stood in the garage and asked what I wanted kept. If someone had walked in that day, they would have seen a good son. That is what makes this hard to explain. A person can be useful and still be moving toward your loss. We worked most of the afternoon. Near dusk, I found one of Linda's recipe cards tucked in a kitchen drawer. Her handwriting was small and slanted. I just stood there looking at it. Daniel came up behind me and said, "Mom would want you to make this easier on yourself." I did not answer right away. Then I asked, "Easier for who?" He smiled a little, like I was joking. "For you, Dad." No one spoke after that. I put the recipe card in my wallet. I still have it. That card kept changing meaning for me. At first it felt like memory. Later it felt like warning. By the time the sale was done, I walked away with around $240,000. It was the result of years, mine and Linda's, mortgage payments, repairs, skipped vacations, practical choices made again and again. I transferred the funds into my account and told almost no one the exact number. Daniel knew roughly. Sarah knew enough. That was all it took. Not long after the sale, they started talking about moving. Again, not as a request at first. As a discussion, a better school district, more space for the kids. Sarah framed it carefully. "We're not asking you for anything." That was the first sentence. Then came the second one. "We're just sharing because we're family." There it was again. Family. The word that made every boundary sound selfish. Daniel said houses in Westerville would set the kids up better. Sarah said opportunities close fast. Daniel said they were trying to think ahead. I listened. I asked a few questions. I did not commit to anything. Then I did something else on purpose. I said, "Good thing you're not expecting help from me. I need to be careful now." I watched both of them. That was another test. Sarah recovered first. She smiled. "Of course. We would never put you in that position." Daniel nodded too quickly. "Right. That's not what this is." Maybe some people would say that response clears them. Maybe. But then Sarah started talking about how families support each other in different seasons. And Daniel said we all pitch in when it matters. The room shifted. Not enough for a scene. Enough for me to notice. Then one of the grandchildren ran in with a school paper. Sarah turned warm again. Daniel laughed. The moment closed. That is how it kept happening. Sharpness. Then softness. A suggestion. Then family noise over the top of it. Within weeks, the idea of the new house became a constant topic. School ratings. Safer streets. Bigger yard. Better future. Every reason sounded respectable. Greed rarely introduces itself as greed. It walks in wearing the children's future. I told myself that if Linda were here, she would want the grandkids to have every advantage they could get. Because once I believed Linda would approve, my resistance weakened. Sarah never asked directly. She only described the gap, what they had, what they needed, what a gift would mean. Daniel said, "We'll figure it out somehow." That word somehow was aimed straight at me. I knew it. I still let it hang there. One evening after the kids were upstairs, Sarah sat at the table and said, "If this works out, it changes everything for them." She meant the children. I asked, "How much are you short?" She looked at Daniel before answering. That was another small thing. Then she said the number. I said nothing for several seconds. Daniel rubbed both hands together and stared at the table. No one pushed. No one had to. I already felt the role opening in front of me. Provider. Bridge. I had spent most of my life in that role. It fit too easily. I told them I would give them $30,000 as a gift. I said gift clearly. Not loan. Not advance. Gift. Sarah's eyes watered immediately. Daniel stood up and hugged me hard. "Dad, are you serious?" "Yes," he said. "This means so much." Sarah said, "The kids will never forget this." Neither of them said Linda's name. I did. I said, "Your mother would want them secure." Daniel looked down. "Yeah," he said. "She would." No one spoke after that, and in that silence I felt proud. I believed I was honoring my wife. I believed I was helping my son build something better. I believed gratitude would shape the arrangement going forward. The new house in Westerville was larger, nicer neighborhood, better schools, according to everyone who talked about it. I moved with them. Same basement plan. Same language. Temporary. Helpful. Family. When we brought the boxes downstairs, Sarah looked around and said, "This is going to work out really well." I said, "For everybody, I hope." She smiled and said, "Of course," but she answered too fast. And I noticed that too. By then, the recipe card from Linda was still in my wallet. I touched it more than once that week. Not for comfort. To remind myself that some things only look simple after they are already gone. I still wanted to believe I was moving closer to family, not deeper into a transaction. I was wrong. I just was not wrong loudly yet. Part 4. Life in Westerville settled into a pattern fast. That is how people get used to imbalance, not in one dramatic fall. In routines, I stayed in the basement just as before. Same bed, same boxes, same promise to myself that I was only staying because it worked for everyone. Upstairs, the family spread into the new house like they had always belonged there. The children had more room. Sarah talked often about how relieved she felt. Daniel seemed proud every time he pulled into the driveway. I did not resent that. What I started noticing instead was how easily my role expanded. I picked up groceries here and there. Then it became regular. Sarah would text, "Could you grab a few things?" A few things turned into full bags. Then full bags turned into weekly runs. I did not mind at first. I was eating the same food. I was part of the household. That is what I told myself. I also kept doing repairs. A broken shelf. A fence latch. A toilet handle that stuck. Daniel thanked me. Sarah praised me more. "You save us so much." At first it sounded like appreciation. Later it sounded like accounting. 3 days a week, I picked up the kids after school. That was never framed as a burden. And honestly, with them it was not. I liked hearing about school and playground drama. Some afternoons they came downstairs with me and spread crayons across the coffee table. Those were real moments. That is why none of this is simple. There was love in that house. There was also use. Those things can live side by side longer than people admit. Daniel mentioned the utility bills were running higher than expected. He did not ask me for money. He just said it. That was becoming their method. Lay out the problem. Wait for me to step into it. I said, "I can cover $300 a month for utilities and internet." Daniel said, "You don't have to do that." Sarah said that would help a lot. So I started paying $300. Later it became $400. No discussion. Just a quiet increase after another conversation about rising costs. Again, nobody asked straight out. Again, I volunteered. But pressure does not need a demand. Sometimes it only needs a decent person in the room. I kept records in my head at first. Then I started writing numbers down on a pad near my bed. Groceries, utilities, internet, shoes for one grandchild when the old pair wore thin. A school fee I covered because Sarah said she was short that week. No one forced any single payment. That is important, because if they had, I might have pushed back sooner. Instead, it came one reasonable thing at a time, and each thing, alone, could be defended. By then, I had started testing reactions more carefully. One Saturday morning, I said over coffee, "I may need to tighten up on extras for a while." I wanted to see where the room moved. Sarah stopped stirring her mug. "Extras?" I said, just being cautious. Daniel looked up from his phone. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said. Just reviewing things. Sarah smiled, but it looked strained. You don't need to worry so much. We've got you. We've got you. A warm sentence, unless you listen too closely. Because underneath it was another message. Stay where you are. Keep the arrangement. Do not start measuring. I let the subject die there. That was another deception. I acted reassured when I was doing the opposite. I was gathering. I was watching which topics made them tense. Money, the house, my independence. Those three always tightened the air. One evening, Daniel and I were alone in the garage. I said, I've thought about maybe spending more time back in Dayton. It was not true. The house was already sold. But I wanted to see his first reaction before his brain corrected the facts. He turned too fast and said, Why? Then he caught himself. His face changed. He laughed once. Habit, I guess. I said nothing. He grabbed a box cutter and pretended to study it. That was enough for me. A man does not react to a place that no longer exists unless he is reacting to something else. Because it pushed me from suspicion to concern. The monthly help kept growing. Eventually, I was covering $500 a month toward groceries on top of the bills. By then, my contribution was near $900 every month, and that was separate from the $30,000 gift, the errands, the childcare, and the repairs. No one ever sat me down and said, Here is all you do for us. That list only existed in my mind. Maybe that was intentional. It is easier to keep using someone when the total stays scattered. Every now and then, I brought up the children and how lucky they were to have stability. I wanted to hear whether gratitude still lived in the house. Sarah would say, We all make sacrifices. Daniel would say, That's what family does. Those answers bothered me, not because they were false, because they were general. Another night, I told Sarah I had looked at a few small condos online. I said it like idle curiosity. She went quiet for 2 full seconds. Then she said, Wouldn't that be lonely? I shrugged. Maybe not. She set a plate in the sink too hard. I just think the kids need you close. The kids. Again, always the cleanest reason. I asked, Do they? Or do you? She looked at me then. Not angry. Measured. Then she smiled. That's not fair. No one spoke after that. I backed off, because I wanted her unguarded another day. I was useful. I was appreciated in language. I was expected in practice. And the more I gave, the less anyone seemed to notice that I was giving at all. By the end of that year, I could feel the shape of the truth without fully naming it. I was no longer just living with my son's family. I was subsidizing them. And once I admitted that much to myself, I knew the next conversations would matter more than the earlier ones ever had. Part 5. The second year in Westerville felt different from the first. Not louder, more efficient. By then, everyone in the house knew what I would probably do before I did it. If groceries were low, I would notice. If a pickup was needed, I would cover it. If something small broke, I would fix it. The arrangement had stopped feeling temporary. No one said that out loud. They did not have to. Temporary things do not settle into systems that smooth. That was the pressure point I kept circling in my head. Not one cruel act, a whole structure. I started adding up numbers more seriously at night. I count because counting clears fog. I wrote down the $30,000 gift. Then the monthly amounts. 300, 400, 500. Then groceries outside those amounts. School items, shoes, little extras that pile up faster than people think. When I laid them in rows on paper, the pattern looked different. Scattered generosity had turned into stable support. That changed the way I heard every conversation upstairs. One evening, Sarah came down and leaned against the doorframe. She asked, Could you get the kids Thursday too? I have something in the afternoon. I said yes. Then I waited. No thanks. No hesitation. Just relief. That bothered me more than if she had sounded demanding. Expectation is colder than asking. A few days later, Daniel mentioned how expensive everything had gotten. He was standing at the counter with mail in his hand. He said it to the room, not to me. Feels like every month costs more than the last. I stayed quiet. Sarah answered from the sink. That's why families have to pull together. She said it without looking at me. That sentence landed where it was supposed to. I still said nothing. No one spoke for several seconds. Then one of the kids came in talking about a class project. The moment passed. But I kept it. The next move came 3 nights later. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open. Daniel sat beside her. I had seen that posture before. Budget posture. Shared front posture. I poured coffee and stayed standing. Sarah said, "We've been trying to think long term." I said, "About what?" She looked down at the notebook. The house. Expenses. Everything. Daniel added, just adult stuff. I almost laughed at that. Instead, I sat down. Sarah started listing categories. Mortgage. Utilities. Repairs. Activities for the kids. Food. Internet. I listened. Then she said, if we rented the lower level to someone outside the family, it would probably bring in $1,500 a month. There it was. Not the ask yet. The setup. I said nothing. Daniel watched me instead of her. Sarah kept going. We've been very generous because you're family. Very generous. That phrase did something to me. Not anger. Clarity. Because by then I was covering around $900 a month already. And yet she was framing my presence as a favor that cost them opportunity. I looked at Daniel. He held my gaze for about 1 second. Then he looked down at the table. That was the silence I remember most. Sarah said, so 1,000 in rent would actually be below market. That was the sentence from the beginning. That was the kitchen night. I asked, on top of everything I already pay? She folded her hands. Those are shared household contributions. This would be rent. Daniel said, Dad, try to hear her out. Hear her out. As if the problem was tone, not math. I had my pad downstairs. I knew the math. I knew what I had given them in cash. I knew what I was giving them every month. I knew how many afternoons I spent in school pickup lines and parking lots with the kids. I asked one more question. Would you ask a tenant to buy your groceries too? Sarah's face changed then. Only slightly. She said, that's unfair. I said, is it? Daniel leaned back in his chair. You're making this into a bigger thing than it is. That line again. Bigger than it is. Overreacting. Family. Practical. By then the language had become familiar enough that I could almost predict it. I did not explode. I just said, I'm not paying rent to live in a house I already help support. Sarah stayed calm. No raised voice. No visible shame. Just calm. We're being realistic, Robert. If this doesn't work financially, then we have to rethink the arrangement. There it was. The soft threat. Rethink the arrangement. Daniel did not challenge it. He only said, nobody wants drama. That is a useful sentence when you are pushing someone and want them quiet. I stood up. My chair scraped the floor. No one moved. I said, I need some time. Sarah nodded once. That makes sense. Like we had just discussed parking. I went downstairs and shut the door. Then I sat on the edge of the bed with the pad in my lap. For the first time, I totaled everything carefully. The gift, the monthly support, the extras, the small purchases. Over $50,000. That number did not include childcare, did not include repairs. Only money. I stared at the page for a long time. Then I took Linda's recipe card out of my wallet and set it beside the numbers. Old handwriting on one side, new arithmetic on the other. No one knocked for a while. When Daniel finally came down, he stopped near the bottom step and said, Dad? I did not look up. He said, Sarah's not trying to hurt you. I answered, then what is she trying to do? He had no quick reply. That silence told me more than anything else that night. I slept very little, not because I was shocked anymore, because I was done translating for them. The next morning, I knew this was no longer about abasement. It was about value. Who assigns it? Who takes it? And what happens when the man being measured finally starts measuring back? Part 6. The morning after the kitchen conversation, nobody mentioned rent. That almost made it worse. Sarah moved through breakfast like nothing had happened. Daniel talked to the kids about school. One of them asked if I was still coming to pick up that afternoon. I said yes. What else was I supposed to say in front of children? No one looked directly at me for long. That silence had a shape. It was not regret. It was waiting to see whether I would fold, apologize, or start acting normal again. I gave them the last one. That was deliberate. I made coffee. I packed lunches. I drove the kids that afternoon. I acted like a man considering things calmly. Inside, I was sorting the house into 2 columns. What was real? What was performance? That became my habit for the next few weeks. If Daniel asked whether I wanted leftovers, that went in one column. If Sarah mentioned costs again while pretending she was not, that went in the other. I stopped guessing and started observing. A few days later, I asked Daniel to talk privately. We sat in the garage with the door half open. I brought the pad with my numbers. He saw it and looked uneasy immediately. I put the paper between us. I want you to look at this. He glanced down. 30,000. Monthly support. Groceries. Extras. I had listed everything as cleanly as I could. No drama. just dates and amounts. He read for less than a minute before saying, "Dad, this isn't really the point." I said, "It is exactly the point." He rubbed his face. "You offered most of this." "I know. Then why are we doing this?" I kept my voice steady. "Because I am not going to pretend I owe you 1,000 a month." He looked at the paper again but did not touch it. "I'm not saying you owe us. I'm saying the arrangement needs to make sense." Make sense. Another clean phrase. I asked, "For who?" He exhaled hard. "For everybody." No one spoke after that. I said, "Do you believe I have been treated fairly?" He did not answer at once. Then he said, "I think Sarah is trying to be practical." That was not an answer. It was also an answer. I stood up and took the paper back. I asked about fairness. He stared past me toward the driveway. Finally he said, "I think you're taking this personally." Personally. That was the moment concern turned into certainty. So I stopped waiting. After that I began planning quietly. I did not announce it. I did not threaten to leave. I wanted facts, options, timing. I started looking at small condos near Westerville and Columbus. Small places, 1 bedroom, simple, manageable fees, close enough to the grandchildren that I could still see them. Far enough to close the wallet they seemed to think lived in my pocket. I did not tell anyone at first. That was my third deception. I let the house think I was still deciding whether to accept their new terms. Meanwhile, I was measuring distance, monthly costs, and how much peace a locked front door can be worth. I have always trusted numbers more than speeches. Numbers do not love you, but they do not pretend either. When I compared condo costs to what I was already handing over, the answer was not complicated. I could live on my own nearby and keep more dignity for less money. One evening I tested Sarah directly. I said, "I've been thinking about your rent idea." Her eyes lifted fast. Daniel across the room went still without meaning to. I continued, "Maybe we should put everything in writing so it's clear." Sarah's expression changed for just a second. Then she said, "Why would we do that?" I shrugged. "You want to be realistic." Daniel jumped in too quickly. "Dad, no one's trying to make this legal." Legal. Interesting word. I had not said it. He supplied it himself, like the idea frightened him. I said, "I'm talking about clarity." Sarah folded a towel once, very carefully. "I don't think that's necessary in a family." There was that word again, family, always used when clarity might reduce access. I let the subject drop, but inside, something clicked even harder into place. They wanted obligation without structure, contribution without accounting, access without limits. That is a very comfortable setup when you are on the receiving end. The children kept me anchored through all of this. They did nothing wrong. That innocence made every decision slower. I did not want my move to feel like abandonment, so I started adjusting my behavior before I moved. Not dramatically, just enough to test how the house reacted. I said no to 1 extra grocery run. Sarah's face tightened, then relaxed. I asked Daniel to handle 1 school pickup because I had an appointment. He sounded irritated before he covered it. I reduced impulse spending on small household items. No one thanked me for the months I had done it before. They only noticed the absence. That told me everything. People reveal your role by how quickly they feel its removal. One Saturday, I told Daniel I might need my financial independence back in a more formal way. He frowned. "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I'm reviewing where I live and what I support." He said, "You make it sound transactional." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "That's exactly what I'm trying to understand." He had no answer. He just stared at the floor. By then, the truth had cracked wide enough that I could see the motive inside it. Not hatred, something more ordinary. They had built their budget around me. Once that happens, a person stops being family in one specific way. He becomes a revenue stream with feelings attached. Near the end of those weeks, I touched Linda's recipe card again before bed. A home is not where your labor disappears. A home is where it counts. In that house, mine was being counted, just not in my favor. And once I knew that for certain, leaving stopped being an idea. It became a timetable. Part 7. Once I had decided to leave, the house felt different under my feet. Same stairs, same basement door, same kitchen table where Sarah had priced me like spare space. But now every room looked temporary to me. That changed the balance immediately. I stopped waiting for understanding. I stopped hoping Daniel would wake up and correct the whole thing. Hope had kept me softer than I needed to be. Without it, I could think cleanly. I kept acting normal for another stretch of time. That was necessary. I wanted a decision made before I announced anything. I wanted keys in my hand. A place lined up. A move planned. No debate. No family meeting designed to wear me down. So I toured condos quietly. Simple places. Nothing large. Nothing sad either. I wanted a home that answered only to me. One afternoon I walked through a small unit not far from them. Good light. Modest kitchen. Enough room for a chair by the window and a shelf for Linda's things. Not far from the grandchildren. Not inside anybody else's budget. I stood in that empty living room and listened. No footsteps overhead. No one framing access to me as generosity. Just quiet. For the first time in a long while, quiet did not feel like grief. It felt like control. That mattered. I ran the numbers again that night. Purchase cost. Fees. Utilities. Insurance. Food. Even after all of it, the monthly burden would be less predictable than what I was already losing where I lived. More importantly, it would be mine. My cost. My decision. My door. I kept testing the edges. I said I might need a few afternoons to myself going forward. Sarah asked, because of what? Not because of where. Not what plans. Because of what? As if independence had to be justified first. I said, I've got things to handle. She looked at me for a second too long. Okay. Daniel asked that night whether I was upset still. Still. Interesting word. As if the kitchen conversation had been one mood I should have finished by then. I said, I'm thinking. He nodded like that was acceptable. Then he changed the subject to one of the kids. That was Daniel's method whenever truth got too close. Angle away. Lower the temperature. Leave the structure intact. I began noticing how often both of them treated time as a solution. Wait long enough and the person who was hurt will start cooperating again. That strategy probably works often. It just stopped working on me. I found the condo I wanted and moved fast. Not recklessly. Precisely. I read every number. Every fee. Every condition. When you have been treated like a source of revenue, you become even more careful about what you sign. I put down money from my own account. Mine. Not a gift. Not shared. Not discussed around a kitchen notebook. Mine. The moment I did that, something in me settled. I had not felt that solid since Linda died. I do not mean happy. I mean aligned. The inside matched the outside again. For months, maybe longer, I had been living as if I owed access to my labor because family had wrapped that expectation in concern. Buying that condo broke the spell. Before I told them, I ran one more test. At dinner, I mentioned a friend of mine from years back who had moved into a condo and loved the freedom. There was no friend. I wanted the room's first reaction. Sarah said, "That sounds lonely." Daniel said, "Depends on the person." Then Sarah added, "Some people don't realize how much support they need until it's gone." I asked, "Support from who?" She smiled. "Community, family, people around you." Clean answer, safe answer. Still, Daniel went very quiet. He knew what she meant. So did I. I said nothing else. No one spoke for a moment. One of the children asked for more water, and the conversation turned. That was another silence I stored away. By then, the emotional part of it had reached its limit. I had been suspicious, then worried. Now I was calm in a colder way. That shift can look harsh from the outside. Maybe some people watching would say I should have confronted them harder. I moved into process, change of address, utilities, packing only what was mine, sorting what I would take from the basement, leaving behind anything that would become a future argument. I even began reducing what I bought for the household without announcing it. No extra snacks, no spontaneous grocery fills, no replacing a broken lamp just because I noticed it. The effect was immediate. Sarah asked twice whether I had forgotten the store list. Daniel asked whether everything was okay with my finances. That revealed the angle more clearly than any confession would have. I answered everything's under control. That was true, just not in the way they thought. I signed final papers a few days later. When I got back to the house, I sat in the car for almost 10 minutes. I took Linda's recipe card from my wallet and read the faded lines again. Years ago, that card had belonged in a kitchen drawer we shared. Then it became something I carried because the old house was gone. Now it meant something else again. It was proof that I knew how to build a life with someone, which meant I also knew when I was no longer living inside one. That night, Daniel came downstairs and said, "You seem different." I said, "I am." He waited. Maybe he wanted more. Maybe he was afraid of more. I did not help him. He asked, "Are we okay?" I looked at him for a long moment and said, "That depends on what happens next." He did not ask what I meant. He just nodded once and left. That was the psychological break. if there was one. Not some shouting match. Not tears. A clean internal snap. I was no longer trying to preserve the arrangement. I was only deciding how to exit it without losing myself or the grandchildren in the process. And once a man gets that clear, the rest becomes logistics. Part 8. I told them on a Sunday evening. I chose that night on purpose. Kids fed. Homework done. No rushing out the door. No excuse for anyone to say the timing was bad. If there was going to be a reaction, I wanted it clean. That was the only trap I set. Not to humiliate them. To remove escape routes. Sarah was at the kitchen counter. Daniel was loading plates into the dishwasher. I said, I bought a condo. Neither of them moved at first. Then Daniel turned too fast. You what? I bought a condo, close by. I'll be moving out. No one spoke. Sarah set a glass down very carefully. When? Soon. Daniel stepped away from the dishwasher. Why would you do that without talking to us? There it was. Not are you okay? Not after everything, we understand. Why without talking to us? I said because talking has been very clear. Sarah crossed her arms. That's not fair. I said, actually that's the first fair thing I've done in a while. Daniel ran a hand over his face. Dad, come on. I stayed with facts. I'm not paying rent here. I'm not continuing this arrangement. I have my own place now. Sarah asked, so that's it? I said, that's it. She looked at Daniel, then back at me. What about the kids? They'll still see me. That's not the same, she said. No, I said, it isn't. No one spoke after that. Daniel leaned on the counter and stared down. Finally, he said, you're acting like we used you. I answered, I'm acting like I finally added it up. He looked up then. For the first time in a long while, he looked more embarrassed than defensive. Sarah recovered first. She always did. We never asked you for most of that. I nodded. You created a house where I was expected to offer it. Her jaw tightened. That is not true. I said nothing. Silence can force people to fill space with their real position. She did. We opened our home to you when you were alone. There it was. The ledger flipped. Their shelter. My debt. I reached into my pocket and took out a folded sheet of paper. Totals. Gift. Monthly support. Extras. I set it on the table. Just their own arrangement written straight. Daniel looked at it first. Sarah did not touch it. I said, you opened your home. I supported your household. Both things are true. Daniel read the number at the bottom and went quiet. Sarah asked, what is this supposed to prove? I said, nothing. I'm done proving. I'm leaving. That was when her calm finally cracked. Only a little. So after everything we did, you're just walking out? Everything we did. Not everything I gave. Not everything I covered. What they did. Even then, the framing stayed the same. I asked, would you have charged me $1,000 in rent if I had not sold my house? Neither of them answered. That question sat between us like a dropped plate. I asked another one. Would you have brought up market value if I weren't already paying your bills and buying your food? Daniel looked away. Sarah said, that is such an ugly way to put it. Ugly. Not inaccurate. Just ugly. I said, it's accurate enough. Daniel finally spoke. You're making us sound like monsters. I shook my head. No. Monsters are easy. This is ordinary. That line stopped him. Because it was true. They were not cartoon villains. They were a son and daughter-in-law who had let money settle into the center of the family structure and then called that structure practical. Sarah said, we were trying to make things work. There it was. The closest thing to motive I had heard yet. Not malice. Need. Budget. Lifestyle. The better house. The better schools. The monthly pressure of a life built one step above comfort. And me in the basement making the gap feel manageable. I know you were. Daniel sat down heavily. Then he said very quietly, so what happens now? That was the first honest question of the whole conversation. I answered it the same way. I move out. I see the kids every week. I come as their grandfather, not as household funding. No one spoke. Sarah stared at the paper but still would not touch it. Daniel rubbed his eyes. I could almost feel the math changing in both their heads. Groceries, pickups, bills. The small invisible supports that had made their life run smoother. That was the real confrontation, not my leaving. Their sudden view of the gap. I picked up the paper before Sarah could move it aside and pretend it had not happened. Then I folded it and put it back in my pocket. That mattered to me. Those numbers were not theirs to keep. Daniel asked, when are you moving? 2 weeks. He nodded once. Sarah said, "That's fast." "Yes." She let out one short breath. "You really decided all this without us." I looked right at her. "That's how it feels when someone else decides what your life is worth." No one answered. That was the line that ended it. The kids came down the stairs a minute later, arguing about a game. Daniel straightened up right away. Sarah turned toward them and put on her normal voice. I watched that happen in real time. Family mode back on. Scene over. That was useful too. It told me I had done the right thing. Later that night, Daniel came downstairs alone. He stood with one hand on the door frame. "I never wanted it to get here," he said. I believed him. That did not change anything. I said, "It got here anyway." He nodded. He looked like he might say more. He did not. He just stood there for a second, then walked back upstairs. That was our confrontation. Not loud, but clean. By the time I went to bed, I was calmer than I had been in months. The exit was real now. So were the boundaries. All that remained was to carry them through the final days without letting anyone pull me back into negotiation. Part 9. The last 2 weeks in that house were the strangest part. Not because anyone fought. Because everyone adjusted without admitting they were adjusting. Sarah became careful around me. Not kinder, just careful. She stopped bringing up money. Stopped mentioning costs. Stopped talking about how families support each other. That silence said more than any apology would have. Daniel tried a different approach. He acted almost normal. He asked about the condo once. Asked what floor it was on. Asked whether parking was decent. He sounded like a son trying not to lose the bridge. I answered him. I was not trying to punish him. I was trying to reset the terms. A few times, I caught Sarah studying me when she thought I was not looking. As if she still believed the right sentence might reopen negotiation. She never found one. The motive came into focus in pieces during those days. Not from a confession, from the shape of their reactions. When I packed, Sarah asked, "Are you taking the extra freezer downstairs?" I said yes. Her face shifted. Not because of sentiment. Because the house had already assigned uses to my things. When I said I would no longer handle the weekly pickups, Daniel asked, "Then what are we supposed to do on Thursdays?" There it was. Not "we'll miss having you here." Not "the kids will be disappointed." What are we supposed to do? The sentence slipped out before he could fix it. That told me more than any speech. I said, "You'll work it out." He looked embarrassed right away. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know how you meant it." No one spoke after that. A few nights later, I heard Daniel and Sarah talking upstairs when they thought I was outside. Not shouting. Tense. I only caught fragments. "Do have to redo everything." Didn't think he'd actually leave. "We can't cover it the same way." That was enough. I did not stand there listening longer. There was the final twist, if anyone still needed one. Not hatred. Not revenge. Not even a deliberate plot from the beginning, maybe. Just dependence that had hardened into entitlement. They had built a better life with me under it. A bigger house in a better district. Extra breathing room every month. Reliable childcare. Reliable grocery support. Reliable repair work. Reliable presence. Then, once that support felt normal, they started pricing it as if it belonged to them. That is how the motive finally looked to me. Not a single evil thought. A series of convenient ones. "He's here anyway. He can help," he offered last time. "It makes sense. It's family." By the end, that language had converted generosity into expectation. Expectation into pressure. Pressure into policy. That is how Sarah could sit at a table and talk about market rent with a straight face. And that is how Daniel could call it practical. When I packed Linda's things, I went slowly. A framed photo. A small blanket she liked. 2 books. The recipe card stayed in my wallet. That one was not for a box. The children noticed first that something real was happening. One of them came downstairs and asked, "Grandpa, are you moving because of us?" That question hit harder than anything Sarah had said. I knelt down and told the truth in the cleanest form I could. "No, I'm moving because grown-ups need their own space sometimes. I'm still close." The child nodded, but not happily. Children know more than adults think. I hated that part. I still do. Daniel saw that conversation from the stairs and said nothing. On my final Saturday there, Sarah came downstairs while I was sealing a box. She stood with her arms folded. "I hope one day you see we were only trying to do what was best for our family." Our family, not the family. Our family. The wording was small, but it mattered. I looked at her and said, "That's exactly the problem." She frowned. "What does that mean?" It means you stopped seeing me as part of it the moment I became useful in a different way. She opened her mouth, then closed it. No one spoke. That was the closest I ever saw her come to uncertainty. Then she said, quietly, I think that's unfair. Maybe some people will think so. Maybe they will say she was stressed. The kids were young, the bills were real, and a household has to survive. All of that can be true. It still does not make me a rentable asset. It still does not make my support invisible. It still does not turn pressure into love. She left without another word. That was the last serious conversation we had before I moved. The morning I left, Daniel helped me carry the final boxes to the car. Again, if someone had watched from the sidewalk, they would have seen a good son. That image is what keeps families like ours misunderstood. Visible help covers invisible damage. He loaded a lamp into the trunk and said, You know you can still come by any time. I said, I know. Then he added, The kids are going to miss having you here. I looked at him. I almost said, Then you should have treated me like I was here. I did not. Instead I said, I'll still see them. He nodded. Then he said the line that settled everything for me. We really did think this made sense. Not we were right. Not we meant well. This made sense. There was the final motive in one sentence. They had not needed me to disappear. They had only needed me to agree that my money, labor, and availability belonged in their monthly plan. It made sense to them. That was enough. I closed the trunk. I looked once toward the basement window where I had lived. Then I got in the car. As I pulled away, no one waved dramatically. No one ran after me. The driveway stayed still. That felt right. I had not escaped villains. I had stepped out of a system built on my willingness to keep giving. Once I understood that, the rest became simple. Not easy. Simple. I kept driving. Part 10. The first night in the condo, I sat on the floor and ate takeout from a paper container. I had a chair. I had a table. I used neither. Boxes against the wall. Lamp not plugged in yet. Coat by the door. Quiet everywhere. But it was my quiet. That changed everything. In Dayton, after Linda died, the house had been empty because someone I loved was missing. In Westerville, the basement had been full of people and still wrong. Here, in this smaller place, the silence did not accuse me of anything. It simply waited for me to build a life inside it. I slept better that first week than I had in a long time. Not perfectly. Grief does not disappear because your address changes. Neither does disappointment. But the constant background pressure was gone. No footsteps overhead meant no unexpected request. No kitchen conversations about costs meant no translation work inside my own head. No one measuring what my presence might be worth. I started arranging things slowly. A picture of Linda on one shelf. Her blanket on the back of the chair by the window. A mug she liked in the cabinet. The recipe card stayed in my wallet for a few more days. Then I finally put it in a drawer in my own kitchen. That felt like the end of something. Not Linda. The carrying. The need to keep one old life folded inside my pocket because the new one did not feel solid enough yet. Now it did. I closed the drawer and stood there with my hand on the handle. No one spoke. There was no one there to speak. Still, the moment felt full. At the start of that week, Daniel texted to ask whether I was settled. I answered yes. He asked if I wanted to come by for dinner Friday. I said I would. I had decided before moving that I would not turn this into a war. Distance was the boundary, not exile. Friday came. I drove over. The kids ran out first. That part had not changed. They pulled me inside like nothing in the world had shifted. Dinner was awkward for about 10 minutes. Then it became almost normal. Daniel asked about the condo. Sarah asked whether the commute was okay. Neither mentioned rent. Neither mentioned my support. Neither mentioned the page of numbers. That silence remained in the room like a closed door. I did not open it. Not because I had forgotten. Because I no longer needed them to agree with me in order to leave. That is the real end of some family conflicts. Not victory. Independence from their version. After dinner, one of the kids asked whether I would still pick them up sometimes. I said sometimes yes. Not every week. The child nodded and went back to dessert. That small exchange said more than the adults had managed in months. Clear limit. Clear answer. No guilt. No performance. Just truth. I kept seeing the grandchildren every week after that. Sometimes at their house. Sometimes out for ice cream. Sometimes at a park. I remained Daniel's father. I did not stop loving him because I saw him clearly. Betrayal does not erase love. It erases illusion. I can love my son and still refuse the structure he accepted. Sarah stayed polite. Nothing more. Maybe she still believes I overreacted. Maybe Daniel half believes that too on certain days. I do not spend much time trying to correct their internal story anymore. People protect themselves with language. Practical, fair, family, overreacting. If those words help them sleep, that is their business. My business is simpler now. I pay my own bills. I buy my own groceries. When I spend money on the grandchildren, it is because I choose to, not because a room has been arranged around my willingness to fill it. That difference is everything. A month after I moved, Daniel came by the condo alone. He stood in the doorway and looked around before sitting down. He said, "It's nice." I said, "It's enough." He nodded. Then he asked, "Are you happier here?" I thought about that before answering. Happier isn't the word. What is? Lighter. He looked down at his hands. No one spoke. Then he said, "I should have handled it better." That was the closest thing to an apology I ever got. It was not complete. It did not name the rent discussion or the money or the years of quiet support. But it was more honest than anything he had said in that garage. I accepted it for what it was. Not repair. A crack in denial. I said, "Yes, you should have." He nodded again. He looked older in my condo than he had in his own kitchen. Just him. Just me. Just two chairs and the truth between them. He asked whether I was still coming to the school play next week. I said yes. That was enough for that day. When he left, he paused at the door and said, "The kids love this place." I said, "They're welcome here." And I meant it. That was my final boundary, really. Not punishment. Not revenge. Access on honest terms. I just know what the numbers said. I know what the silences said. I know what Daniel's face looked like when I asked about fairness and he could not answer. And I know how Sarah said $1,000 with a steady voice, like she was naming a weather forecast. That is enough for me. I did not get revenge. I did not demand repayment. I did not cut anyone off. I bought a small place near the people I love and stopped letting them price my presence. At this age, that is sometimes the cleanest version of justice available. Not triumph. Not reconciliation. A door. A lock. A weekly visit that starts because I choose it. Tonight, the condo is quiet again. Linda's photo is on the shelf by the window. The lamp is on. My keys are in the bowl by the door, and no one gets to tell me what that is worth.